Hello and welcome to the August version of a Midwest Concussion Clinic monthly lunch and learn. Today, the title of our conversation is When the Tests Are Normal, What's the Next Step? So, from a provider perspective, one of the most difficult things that we run into is okay, all of the advanced imaging that we're looking at, all the blood work, the testing, it's all coming back normal. So, what does that necessarily mean for the patient? And when we start to look at that process of things looking normal for the patient, it can be frustrating from a patient perspective. All of these images that I'm getting done, everything that we're doing is coming back negative. So why do I feel the way that I do? So for those of you that are new to this whole process, every third Wednesday of the month at noon Eastern time here on our YouTube channel and over on TikTok Live, I go through and put together the Midwest Concussion Clinic monthly lunch and learn for the month. I cover a topic. We break it down. These longer kind of version videos or webinars are more designed for the providers or people that are trying to navigate through the healthcare system. If you're new to who I am, my name is Matt. I'm the owner of the Midwest Concussion Clinic. I also put out a podcast every Thursday, usually by the end of the day, Thursday around 4 to 5 p.m. I put together a Midwest Minute with Matt, simple concussion conversations that just make sense. The goal is that I break down from a patient in a support system perspective what concussion recovery looks like and how we can navigate through that concussion recovery journey. So without further ado, thank you for joining me for today's monthly lunch and learn. If you guys ever have any questions, you can hop into the chat here on YouTube or over on our TikTok. You can hop into the chat. If you're looking at this and watching it from a replay, you can DM me on any social media platform at MW Concussion. I will happily answer any question that you might have, whether you're a provider or a patient or somebody who's just trying to navigate through their own concussion recovery journey. My goal throughout the entirety of my life is to help people. So if you've got a question, there's a good chance that there are hundreds of other people out there that have the same question. So feel free to ask them. I will answer any questions that you guys might have and might come up with. So the topic for today is when testing is normal, what do we run into? What happens? The more testing that we do for concussions, the more things that are going to come back normal. But just because testing is quote unquote normal doesn't mean that the patient isn't necessarily struggling. Just because the CT scan comes back negative doesn't mean that an injury hasn't occurred. And when we start sitting down with patients to try to explain that concept, it can be really challenging for them to grab onto. Well, they told me my scans were normal, that I should be fine. As providers, we need to be careful with how we provide that information and how we deliver that information. Just because a scan or a test comes back normal doesn't mean that an injury hasn't occurred. And it needs to be understood that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. A patient can be struggling and advanced imaging testing can be normal. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the patient will feel normal. Just because a CT scan or an X-ray or an MRI or blood panel comes back as normal doesn't mean that there's not something going on that's physiologically causing the symptoms that we have. And that's the first kind of takeaway lesson for today, that as providers, we need to be careful with how we're phrasing things. Just because the image is normal doesn't mean that there hasn't been an injury. Concussions are considered an invisible injury, and that's something that as providers we have to portray to the patients that we're looking after. Now, I understand that it can be really challenging to portray that message given the constraints of time that we have. But from a takeaway messaging to a patient, if you're telling them, hey, your scans are normal, and then you follow it up with, okay, well, you'll be better in a couple days. If it takes longer to recover, the first concept is not, or the first thought is not, well, I'm doing fine. The first thought is, what's wrong with me? Everybody told me that my scans were normal. Why do I feel the way that I do? So if I can get a key takeaway from today, it's that as providers, just because a scan is coming back normal doesn't mean that we tell the patient, hey, everything's normal, you're fine. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean that the injury didn't occur, and it doesn't mean that the patient's not still dealing with the difficult challenges of navigating through an invisible injury. So again, those two pieces are a kind of puzzle that we have to put together. They have to understand that, yes, the testing did come back normal, but what is a CT scan, an X-ray, or an MRI looking for? Generally, those things are looking for structural changes. After a concussion, there are no structural changes that are happening. So I can argue from a biological perspective at the like at the microscopic level, yes, there's damage that occurs and there's change. But if I'm looking at a CT scan, an X-ray, and an MRI, more often than not, depending on the research that you're looking at, 90 to 95% of the time, those CT scans initially are going to come back negative. Now, does that mean that the injury didn't happen? No. Does that not mean that there's structural, microbiological changes? There's a neurometabolic cascade that happens, but that doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no structural damage, right? A CT scan's looking for that life-threatening structural brain bleed. Well, if it comes back negative, does that mean the patient has escaped, a life-threatening injury? Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. That is piece one of the puzzle. We have ruled out that there's any structural damage. But at the end of the day, just because there's no structural damage doesn't mean that there's no neurometabolic cascade that's happening. There's no change to the brain chemistry makeup. There's no change to the hormone production. There's no change to all of those things. So we have to make sure that we understand that the pieces of the puzzle do go together. Normal testing is great, but that doesn't mean that symptoms aren't necessarily going to stop or that symptoms aren't progressing. Those two are pieces of the concussion recovery puzzle. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And we need to understand when we're relaying that message to patients, they have to get that concept. It is very tough to get them to understand in a short amount of time. So we have to relay that information to them in multiple ways. We have to make sure that they're insured or reassured that structural damage is not here, but that doesn't mean that the injury hasn't happened. So if I am putting together kind of a synopsis on a patient, I go through the CT scan comes back negative, the X-ray comes back negative, the MRI comes back negative, the blood work comes back as normal. What other testing am I trying to order? That's not necessarily what we need to think. We need to think, okay, if all of these things are coming back normal, great. If we look at the basic definition, the widely accepted definition of a sport-related concussion, the very final sentence literally says no other neurological explanation for symptoms. If one of the definitions, like criteria for the definition of a concussion states no other neurological explanation, we expect all these tests to come back as negative. We expect every single thing to come back as within normal ranges or within normal limits or even, moderately elevated things. But if we start looking at, okay, all of these things are coming back negative, what other tests do I order? We need to start looking at function. Why aren't they functioning normally? Not what test is coming back abnormal, but what are they noticing that is not coming back as normal? And that's that next step as providers. If I'm sitting here as a family medicine provider and I'm trying to figure out, what else we need to do, we need to start looking at function, not at advanced imaging, not at advanced testing. We need to start figuring out why the patient is not functioning the way that they used to be before the injury has occurred. So the first step to that problem is we need to figure out what's changed. So as a provider, there's the subjective nature that comes into play. I have no idea who a patient is healthy. No clue, right? I learn as the steps evolve and as we continue to progress through the injury, but I don't know who they are healthy. So I have to take a patient's word for it. I have to listen. As a provider, we have to listen to what the patient is saying. And trust me, I understand. It can be difficult based on the time constraints that are available to us in the modern medical model that we have. But one thing we need to keep in check, or we need to continue to focus on advancing when it comes to specifically treating traumatic brain injuries, concussion, persisting post-concussion symptoms, or any other chronic condition, is we need to listen to what the patient is telling us. We need to know what they were doing beforehand. Then we need to know that the event occurred. And then we need to know what they're doing afterwards. When we start looking at trying to figure out the next steps as providers, we need to listen to what limitations they're saying. And oftentimes, it can be heard with what they're not saying. A real life example. Okay, if I break down, I have a patient who is working a full-time job, 40 hours a week at a desk. And they sit here and say, okay, before the injury, I was working 40 hours a week. I was coming home. I come home to 2 kids. I provide for my kids. I cook dinner. We make sure that they got their schoolwork done. We go to travel baseball or softball. We go to volleyball games. And then I come home and I'm able to, decompress and do my things that I enjoy doing for fun, whether it's mowing the yard, woodworking, reading a book, knitting, cooking, baking, cricketing, social media, whatever that is. And then I could go to bed without having any problems. I sleep up and down like a normal person, but for the most part, I sleep really well. Great, that's a normal function. So now let's say we have that same person who got into a car accident on the way home from work. Before the injury, they did all of these things. Then they got into a car accident. And then afterwards, I'm going to work 4 hours and then I'm coming home and I'm going to bed. Sounds very similar, right? Or even like I'm going to work and working 8 hours and then I'm coming home and going to bed. But they didn't fill in what they did after work, right? They didn't talk about going to sporting events. They didn't talk about the things that they do to decompress. They didn't talk about the things that they're doing for fun because they're not doing them. Because they are literally giving every single ounce of energy, effort, and symptom-free time that they have by trying to survive. They're going to work and then they're coming home and they're crashing. You have to listen to what's being said. We have to listen to what's being left out. We have to listen to the patient's experience. Now, concussions are a marriage of objective and subjective information. We have the objective testing that we can do, and that would be something that we can cover at a later date, at a later time, because objectively, there are testing that we can do, and it has nothing to do with advanced imaging or blood work. It has to do with eye movements, body movements, the ability to test single task and dual task. We have to test those things individually, but we have to learn about what's changed. We have to look for what patterns that we're starting to see. If I have a patient sitting down telling me that their dizziness is going up, well, what's happening? When is dizziness going up? What are you noticing that you're doing when dizziness happens? The more you talk to the patient, they'll start to explain that, okay, when I get dizzy, it comes on for a couple seconds and then it goes away. Well, great. Is it random? Is it when I'm sitting in a chair? If I ask a follow-up question, I want to know which questions to ask. And generally it has to do with, when are you getting dizzy? What are you noticing? What activities are you doing before you get dizzy? Is there anything that you can tell me about after getting dizzy that you're noticing that's different? Is there anything you have to do to get the dizziness to go down, or are you along for the ride? One of my favorite questions when it comes to asking about symptoms is, describe the dizziness without actually saying the word dizzy. Because in our world, there's a big difference between dizziness, lightheadedness, floating, fogginess, mental clarity, feeling like the world's rotating clockwise versus counterclockwise, or rotating in a parietal plane versus a sagittal plane, getting that pitching and yawing. All of those different descriptors for dizziness are all different causes inside the body. So if we're talking to a patient and asking them, hey, what's happening to dizziness? What are you noticing? Describe the dizziness. Are there any symptoms that go up with it? What happens when you get nauseous? Are you eating like you're supposed to? Are you not eating because you're dizzy and nauseous? Does nausea come up when you get dizzy? Do you vomit when you're nauseous? All of these questions need to be asked from a provider perspective when we sit down with a patient to try to figure out what limitations that we're running into. Everything that I just talked about, it's not going to show up on a CT scan. It's not going to show up on an X-ray. It's not going to show up on an MRI. In the healthcare world, we have lost focus on the fact that we're treating people. It can be really hard with the model that we have. We are treating people, dynamic, changing individuals. We are not treating tests. We are not treating numbers on a spreadsheet. Just because the CT scan comes back as negative does not mean that there is nothing going on. Just because the blood panel comes back as negative or normal in all ranges does not mean that the neurometabolic cascade hasn't happened. We are treating dynamic, ever-changing individuals. And that's something that we need to get a handle on or understand when we're looking at providers and trying to advance our treatment of brain injuries. So we're going through, we're listening to a patient. My biggest thing that I will talk about is I'm trying to help a patient find a fine line between doing too much and not enough in concussion recovery. One of the biggest challenges is that fine line is going to change. If I give a patient 10 things to do for the next 10 days, they might feel 10 completely different ways afterwards. And as a provider looking in that pattern of variability is feedback, right? Variability in their day-to-day life, their day-to-day symptom production or presentation is valuable information for us trying to help a patient navigate through this. If they're telling me that every single day they get to 6 p.m. and they're crashing, okay, how are they feeling leading up to 6 p.m.? What happens at 6 o'clock? Do they drive home? Do they go through trying to cook and clean and do all these different things? Are they going to a baseball game at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock? Are they driving through rush hour traffic? Or is it that, hey, 6 o'clock, normally I'm in bed by 7 o'clock, or normally I'm just waking up at 6 o'clock? We need to start looking at the variability in that day-to-day to try to find out patterns. I love trying to deconstruct a patient's day. I want to sit down and I want to know what you do on a regular basis. What's your happy place? Are you working? Are you not working? What activities are you normally doing that you're avoiding? Because I want to put together what a normal day looks like. The brain loves patterns. The brain loves structure. After a brain injury, patterns and structure tend to fall apart. I was working 40 hours a week and now I'm down to 20 hours a week, or I'm off of work. I was going to school 5 hours a day. Now I'm off of school and I don't know what to do. When there's not a pattern, our sleep pattern struggles, our sleep-wake cycles will struggle, the energy production will struggle. We have to fill 8 hours a day with stuff that, may not necessarily make us feel the greatest. So when we sit down and try to figure out that variability, my first thing that I want to do with a patient is I want to understand what a normal day looks like for them. I want to know, hey, do I wake up at the same time? Do I go to bed at the same time? Does it vary based on Monday, Wednesday, Friday? I do X, Y, and Z. Tuesday, Thursday, I do Q, R, and S. I want to make sure that I have a general understanding, because when I sit down and talk to a patient, say, hey, how did your day go today? Well, I got dizzy about 2 o'clock. Bam, I know at 2 o'clock, this is what generally they're doing, so I have a better understanding of what 2 o'clock looks like. Now we can break that down. Okay, what were you doing today at 2 o'clock that you noticed? Did you get up and go to the bathroom at 2 o'clock and now all of a sudden I'm dizzy again? Did I, was I in a meeting from noon to 1 and now all of a sudden I'm spiraling out of control by 2 o'clock? The variability in their day and the variability in how they're describing their symptoms is feedback for every single provider that's involved with treating concussions. We need to be able to break down that variability and understand what is happening when we talk about patients' variability and symptoms. Just because a patient is telling you that, hey, I do the same thing every day, doesn't mean that they are like clockwork doing the exact same thing every day. As providers, it takes time for us to gather that information. As a patient, the more information and detail that you can give your provider who's going through this with you, the better. The more you can tell me that, hey, from 1 to 2, I was watching a video on YouTube. Okay, great. That's fantastic. That tells us, okay, that maybe there's a visual vestibular interruption. If you're telling me that, hey, at 5 o'clock I drive home and then by 6 o'clock I'm crashing and going to bed, now I can break down as a provider and go, okay, look, that driving home is something that we need to look at. We need to look at, okay, was it a traffic, did you have a lot of traffic? Did you drive through construction? Was one route closed? Was there, based on where we're at, was there flooding? Was something that was happening, causing issues or not? And then I can break down and I understand that the variability is happening. As providers during concussions, we are treating a dynamic, changing injury inside of a dynamic, changing individual. Nothing is going to work on paper like it's supposed to. The ability to adapt, the ability to change a treatment plan, the ability to break down and understand what's actually happening is key to treating concussions effectively. So when I sit down and I'm talking with a patient, the symptoms that they're telling me, I have to look at not necessarily each individual system. Yes, great. I need to make sure that each individual system is working. Wonderful. If you've been following along with me this last week or so, all last week I talked about the recovery machine. And what I meant by the recovery machine is that each individual component of the machine has to work. If each individual component of the machine doesn't work, the machine doesn't work. But not only does each individual piece of this recovery machine have to work, that individual piece of the recovery machine has to work with every other portion of the machine. So just because the visual system is working in a vacuum doesn't mean visual and vestibular integration is working. Just because we're not getting any cervical pain when we're sitting down doesn't mean that the patient doesn't have cervical pain when they first wake up in the morning. Doesn't have a limitation or a tightness when they rotate their head to the right versus rotating their head to the left. Each of these systems in a vacuum have to work. But if these systems don't work together, the recovery machine falls apart. I have to look at the entire system. One of the areas that I am starting to kind of look into, and it's something that I talk about with every patient, and it's one of the bigger areas in concussion research, is the changes to hormone production that happens after a brain injury. Okay, we look at an energy production problem. We look at a hormone fluctuation problem. Do they have hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism? Do they run into issues with hypopituitarianism? Do they run into issues where the body is not producing hormones the way that they're supposed to? Well, if I'm testing blood work in a static position in a fasted state and it's coming back, one way, do I have any tests that are looking at the elevated cortisol levels? Do I have any dynamic blood work that's done? If I have somebody who's coming in and they've done a blood panel and I'm looking at it and sitting down with them and we're looking at vitamins A and B12 and C and D, they're all coming back in a low end of normal, but they're normal. Well, we've got them on a multivitamin at minimum every day. A patient that's telling me, well, I take 10,000 IUs of vitamin D every day because I live in the Midwest and it's the wintertime, but yet their blood work says it's on the low level of normal. That needs to be something in a red flag that we look at. So just because a test is coming back as normal doesn't necessarily mean that there's not an issue that's going on. Right? If we look at everything in a vacuum, in a perfect world, and it comes back as X, Y, and Z, we need to understand that dynamic changes are happening with this individual. And as a provider, that's what's so frustrating about concussions. I can order every test under the sun, and it all comes back negative, and I've got a patient who's sitting here in tears going, well, why do I feel the way that I do? It can be really tough to show somebody that just because the testing is negative doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong. When I sit down and I talk with a patient who's coming into me and they've got a CT scan that's done, an MRI done, a blood work that's done, a cardiac screen that's done, great. We've ruled out all of these other causes for our symptoms. Now we can look at how the system is interacting with other parts of the system, how each individual portion of that system is interacting, and we can break it down and say, okay, look, yes, when I sit down in a chair and I look at a computer screen, I can move my eyes around no problem. But if I'm outside and I'm watching a bird fly around, or if I'm trying to go from bird feeder to bird feeder, I feel like I'm going to throw up. We need to look at how the systems are interacting with each other. The patient is a dynamic person, right? This whole lecture has talked about the fact that we are treating a dynamic injury inside of a dynamic vessel. If I'm looking at everything from a static perspective, I'm not going to find what I need. If I look at everything as, black and white, I'm looking at, okay, this test is normal, this test is normal, this test is normal. Wonderful. But what happens when I have a low end of normal and a high end of normal of somebody that we've got loaded through with supplements because we're trying to help with the neurometabolic cascade? We need to start looking at the bigger picture. And it can be really challenging, especially if we don't have somebody who's got understanding of the dynamic nature of traumatic brain injuries. When I sit down with a patient who's come from primary care, my first comments and my first conversation is the primary care physician or provider has done an excellent job at making sure that everything that they're taught is normal. It's nothing that they've done wrong. Any other provider that you've worked with before somebody comes in and works with me, they haven't done anything wrong. They have treated it through the lens or through the scope that they have. They have looked at it the way that they have been trained to, and they have looked at it the way that they're supposed to. I tell everybody all the time, one of the perks of my job is all I do all day, every day is concussions. That's it. I don't do anything else. So I have to know everything about one very specific injury. And one of the ways that I learn about them is I learn how the systems fit together, not how they work individually. So breaking it down back to the example of dizziness from earlier, right? Breaking it down back from the person who's going to work all day and then coming home and they're crashing. Dizziness is a very complex thing. If I start looking at the idea behind dizziness, dizziness can be cardiac related, it can be autonomic related, it can be vestibular related, it can be vision related, it can be sleep related, it can be dehydration, it can be malnutrition, it can be that I'm overwhelmed or overstimulated, it can be environmental stress. Dizziness is a really complex symptom. So if I'm testing somebody's inner ear function through canalithic repositioning techniques, or I'm going through the Epley's test, or I'm going through and doing like a fixed gaze test, or I'm going through and doing an impulse test, or I'm putting somebody through a static vestibular test, okay, great. Maybe the dizziness isn't coming from the vestibular system. If all of those tests come back normal and a patient is still telling me that they're dizzy, I need to listen to the patient to figure out what type of dizziness that they're dealing with. I can tell you from experience, when I sit down with a patient that tells me they're dizzy, a lot of times they're actually describing mental fogginess. They're describing that they feel uneasy or unsteady, and it's not necessarily a proprioceptive issue. It's not necessarily a cervical issue. It's not necessarily a visual or vestibular issue. It's the energy side of things. They feel run down, they feel lost, they feel disoriented because they're overstimulated. They don't have the energy to keep up with what they're trying to do. They're cognitively overloaded. Yes, there is a component of traditional vertigo that comes in with brain injuries, but that's why treating somebody with a brain injury with traditional vestibular therapy doesn't work as often as we used to think. And it's because it's not just a vestibular issue. It's not just a visual issue. It's not just an autonomic issue. It's a combination of these things, and we need to understand that moving forward. One symptom is influenced by multiple different things, and it's not just dizziness. Every symptom that you run into is going to be affected by multiple different systems. So again, going back to breaking these things down, how do we figure out what we're supposed to do next? What are we supposed to do from a provider perspective when a test comes back normal? We need to talk with a patient and understand what they could do before they got hurt versus what they can do today. And I need to look at every aspect of their life. If I've got somebody from a work comp perspective who's coming in and telling me, well, I can't work my job. Okay, what part of your job isn't working for you? What part of that movement, what part of your job description can I look at to figure out what you're doing at work that might be too complex for your system? And how can we modify that to ensure that we're keeping people in work? Because from a recovery perspective, keeping them in that environment that they're going in every day is beneficial. Concussion recovery is great, but life is not done sitting in front of a computer screen or sitting in a calm environment doing visual exercises. Life is loud. Life is complex. Life is movement. We are treating a dynamic injury inside a dynamic vessel. If I'm treating everything in calm, what happens when a patient comes out of calm? What happens when a patient goes back to their normal routines? If I'm just looking at everything from a static perspective or a calm perspective, what am I doing to address life after the injury? What am I doing to address reintegration back into life? What is a patient doing now that they weren't able to do before the injury? What is a patient doing before the injury or not doing now that they were able to do before the injury? I need to look at everything in a total picture, not just in a vacuum. And that can be really challenging, especially if I'm not trained in specifics when it comes to brain injuries. I look at my information that I'm given, I read the image, I read the test, I read the response, and it's all normal. Great. But I still have a patient who's sitting in my office telling me that I'm not normal. I need to understand what part of that the patient is experiencing, and I need to understand that I'm looking for a pattern in changes. I need to find the pattern that's happening. When I sit down and listen to a patient, the first thing that I am doing is I am listening to understand. I am listening to make sure that I am getting what they're saying. I'm not listening to respond, or I'm not listening to downplay what they're going through, and I'm not listening to sit here and completely dismiss them. I am listening so I understand what it is that they're saying, and I understand what it is that they might not be saying. I need to sit down and find the pattern. How did you get hurt? What are you noticing that's changed after the hurt? At what part of the day are you noticing that symptoms are changing? And what are you avoiding doing because of those changes that you're having? Each step in that process will put together a pattern. We are trying to put a puzzle together. If I look at the puzzle individually in each piece, it's great, but it only works if I know how to put the puzzle together. It only works when I can find the patterns. I speak in analogies a lot. And one of the analogies that I use for providers is we have a puzzle. If you've ever tried to put together a jigsaw puzzle, I have yet to find somebody who dumps all of the pieces out in the middle and goes, okay, cool, I'm going to flip them all over and then we're just going to start. Generally, we have a pattern that we're looking for. I put the edges together. The main part of my picture I'm putting together. I put all the blue pieces in one pile, all the yellow pieces in another pile, all the green pieces in another pile, and I can start to put it together that way. If we can start putting together a puzzle that way, we need to put together brain injury recovery the same way. We need to look for patterns. If I get dizzy when I turn my head to the right, what happens to the neck musculature when I passively rotate somebody to the left? What happens to the neck musculature on the right side versus on the left side? What happens when I have them track an object with their eyes only moving to the left? What happens when I have them track nose and eyes together when they're moving to the left? If I have a patient who sits down and says, hey, Matt, when I turn my head to the left, it's harder than when I turn my head to the right. Okay, that's a pattern. You tell me every time I turn my head to the right, that's a pattern. From a therapy perspective, if I'm making a patient go through and do an exercise to the right, and they tell me that, hey, it's harder going to the right versus the left, great. We are going to break down and we are going to redo that exercise again. If I redo the exercise but start you in the other direction, is it still more difficult moving to the right versus moving to the left? Is it still more difficult going up versus going down? Is it more the duration of the movement, the complexity of the movement, or is it the timing of the exercise? Is the background that you're looking at different on the right side versus different on the left side? If I sit down with a patient and all of their scans are coming back normal, all of their dynamic testing is coming back normal, what's the environment that I'm testing them in? If I'm working with somebody, let's say I have a patient that I'm working with multiple different providers, multiple different specialties, and everyone is telling me that, hey, they're doing great. And then when I sit down and talk to them and about, hey, what's life look like? They're talking about they're still not going out and reintegrating back at life. Okay, now we sit down and look at speech therapy is doing things in a quiet room by themselves. Physical therapy is a one-on-one treatment session in a quiet room. Occupational therapy is a one-on-one treatment session in a quiet room. But a patient works in a factory around loud noise. Are they stimulating enough to stimulate the problem? Are they trying to mimic enough of their day-to-day routine that we're getting that problem? Concussion recovery needs to be functional. Concussion treatment needs to be functional. Our testing needs to be functional. During brain injury recovery, we are treating a dynamic injury inside a dynamic vessel inside a dynamic environment. If I'm treating a static injury in a static vessel in a static environment, wonderful. That's great. But eventually they're going to become dynamic. Eventually they're going to have to reintegrate back into life. Eventually they're going to have to get back to their normal. If I'm telling everybody that their normal is based on a static environment and a calm test or a static test, I'm doing a disservice to the patient because I'm not looking at the dynamic nature of life. Okay? We have to find the patterns. We have to dissect and listen to what the patient is telling us to find that pattern. Now that you have a pattern, what do we do about it? Right? So now that I have broken down a pattern, okay, let's say with this individual in this specific instance, testing is coming back normal, but they're still telling me that they're dizzy. Visual environments increase the dizziness. And what I mean by visual environments, I get more dizzy when I'm at the grocery store versus more dizzy when I'm sitting in my living room with nothing going on. By the end of the day, my dizziness is higher. When I drive, dizziness is the worst. So I've shortened my workday, but shortening my workday doesn't make the dizziness go away. It just makes the dizziness get less. We have a pattern. With this specific individual, we have a pattern. So noticing with this specific individual, I have ruled out cardiac screens. I've ruled out CT scans, x-rays, MRIs coming back. So we know it's not a structural issue, but the dizziness is happening. But they're telling me I get dizzy in visual environments. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to look at the visual system. I want to assess the visual system in a static environment in a neutral position. Great. I can't reproduce symptoms with them looking straight ahead in a calm environment. Okay. Now if I get them to tuck their chin down to their chest and do the same position, that increases dizziness. Great. So now all of a sudden I have some issues with that increase in dizziness. Now I need to look at, is there a cervical component? Because I had them change their environment. I had them change looking down. Okay, all of that comes back normal. Now I need to assess it in a busy environment. Do I put them on a checkerboard? Do I put them on black and white lines? Do I put them on, looking at a screen that's got something that's like a functional environment, like a factory environment or a grocery store, and I'm making them follow an object through a dynamic or a busy background. Does that increase our visual stimulus or increase our dizziness? Great. We now start to look at, okay, now we're dealing with a visual disruption in a busy environment. If all that comes back negative, why am I getting a decrease in, performance or an increase in dizziness by the middle of the afternoon? Well, now we know that it's a combination of their day. When I sit down and try to break down concussion recovery for a patient, I tell them getting visual movements, getting ocular motor movements, getting things to work again the way that they're supposed to is relatively easy. The most difficult part of concussion recovery is speed and endurance. We can get systems to work very quickly for a short amount of time. It's really like clockwork. It's not super difficult. Yes, there are difficult cases. Yes, there are people that take longer than others. But for the most part, in a calm environment, in a vacuum, we can get eye movement to come back to normal relatively quickly. I always say relatively with a patient because to a patient, relatively was right after the injury. To me, it's after a couple therapy visits. It's after them doing their home exercise for a couple days. We can retrain the brain to do things that it wants to do that it normally is used to doing relatively easy for a short amount of time. Building speed and building endurance are very, very difficult. And I am flat out with a patient. I see a patient once to twice a week. That's it. That's 2 hours a week. There's 168 hours in a week. That means that for 166 hours, I need to make sure that the patient has enough tools in their toolbox to figure it out. If you're an advanced provider or you're somebody who's only seeing them once every 6 weeks or once every other week, even from a work comp perspective, what are you helping them with in the interim? Are you just telling them, hey, good luck? It'll get better. Eventually you'll get better. Or are you actually helping them through therapies? Are you setting them up with physical therapy, with vestibular therapy, with, occupational therapy, vision therapy? Are you setting them up with somebody who's helping them from the psychological perspective? Are you helping them, or are you just sitting here and simply monitoring them? From a patient perspective, one thing I hear all the time is nobody's doing anything. I go into these doctors every couple of days, or I go into these providers every other week, and they're telling me that, yeah, I'll get better next time. 2 more weeks, 2 more weeks, 2 more weeks. Well, it's already been 3 months and I feel worse now than when I started. We need to start looking at what are we doing between our visits? What are we doing to help them navigate through their lives? Every patient that I work with, I tell them, my job is to give you tools for your toolbox that you can implement right away. Now, my job is to help you get back to your normal, but I need to make sure that you have the toolbox, because for 2 hours a week you're with me, that means there's 166 hours where you have to figure it out. And if you're not giving a patient those tools as a provider, we're doing them a disservice, because we're expecting changes to happen, but we're not giving them the tools to make the changes happen. If I'm treating a dynamic injury in a dynamic vessel in a dynamic environment, and I'm not giving them tools to navigate through that, they're going to become static. They're not going to go out anymore. They're going to sit in a dark room and not do anything. They're going to avoid getting stimulated by their daily routines. They're going to avoid that day-to-day life. They're going to avoid that stimulation. And when we avoid that stimulation, we run into issues, because eventually they're going to go back out into the real world. And if they do, what's going to happen to symptoms? So we have to identify the pattern. And when we identify the pattern, that tells us what the limitation truly is. So when we sit down as providers, the question that we need to be asking ourselves is not necessarily what other test can we throw at them? What other imaging do they need? What other thing can we do? What other scan do they need? We need to stop asking, what haven't we done? What test haven't we looked at? And we need to start breaking down what patterns is the patient seeing. We need to listen to understand the injury. We need to listen to understand what the patient is going through, not to answer the question. We need to understand what patterns are we missing. And a lot of it comes when a patient will sit down subjectively and tell you what happens through their day. Oftentimes we have to listen to what's being said, and we need to listen to what they aren't saying, and we need to listen to those things to find the pattern. So when I sit down and I'm talking to somebody who's struggling through this, right, trying to find that pattern, a lot of times it's not necessarily somebody trying to look at a pattern. We need a different perspective. We need somebody who's looking at it through a different lens. The concussion recovery machine that I mentioned earlier talks about each individual system working together to make the person work again. That's the same way a concussion recovery team needs to be assembled. Each team looks at the same injury from a different lens. If I'm looking at it from a concussion lens and my primary care provider is looking at it through a cardiac lens, we need to make sure that we're both looking at the same problem and we're looking at it from a different perspective. If I'm going through and I'm looking at somebody who comes into me and says, hey, I fell and hit my head, I was feeling okay for a couple of days, and then afterwards I feel terrible, and I'm looking at it from a concussion perspective, but all of my testing is coming back normal, great. That means it's not a concussion problem. That means it's not a traumatic brain injury problem. I need to look at it from a different lens. I'm not telling you I have all the answers either. When I have a patient who's stuck, we need to get a different perspective. And that's how concussion recovery works the best. When I have a dynamic injury inside a dynamic vessel in a dynamic environment, I need a concussion recovery team that's treating things dynamically. I need to make sure that we're all on the page working towards the same goal, but understanding that it's a dynamic injury and it needs to be adjusted and needs to be treated as such. If you guys have stuck around this long, thank you so much for watching. The Midwest Concussion Clinic Monthly Lunch and Learn is every third Wednesday of the month at 12 Eastern Time. I take a different topic and I try to break it down to make it easier and understandable for people that work through healthcare, that are helping them trying to navigate through the healthcare system or trying to help somebody get back to their normal recovery. Because brain injuries are complex. Brain injuries are the marriage of physiological, psychological, hormonal, cognitive, it's all of those things coming together inside of a dynamic vessel. So if there's something that you would like to learn more about, or there's a topic that you want covered, please DM me at mwconcussion.com. I love doing these things. At the end of the day, the Midwest Concussion Clinic is an information company. Be on the lookout for Midwest Concussion Education. My goal is to get it up and running by Q4 this year, where I can start putting out educational content for patients, for people, for providers, to try to train people to think the way that I do when it comes to treating brain injuries. There are, I want to say this is Midwest Concussion Clinic Monthly Lunch and Learn number 15. So I've got 14 other, stories that are out there, 14 other webinars that are out there on various topics. Each month I put together something that I'm seeing in clinic or I'm seeing with patients and trying to put it together so it's easy to understand. You can follow along at all of our social media at MW Concussion. If you ever have any questions, I will answer any question that comes up in the DMs, because if you've got a question about something, there's somebody out there, whether it's a patient or a provider or a support care member or somebody who's just interested in learning, there's that person out there, has that information, has that question. If you've got it, so does somebody else. I'll answer anything. You can catch my podcast, A Midwest Minute with Matt, simple concussion conversations that just make sense. It drops every Thursday with a new episode where I take a complex conversation that I've been having, whether it be with patients or with a support system in the clinic, and I break it down and make it easier to understand, because when I work with a patient, I want them to understand that the information that I'm giving them inside their meetings or inside their appointments is the same information that I'm giving to everybody out there. I'm not hiding behind trying to make them feel better. I'm not hiding behind answering questions to curtail their situation. It's the same information that I put out, because if they have a problem or they have a question that they're navigating, so does somebody else. And a Midwest Minute with Matt is simple concussion conversations that just make sense. I take one complex topic and break it down so it's easier to understand for the viewers that are watching. They're 10 to 15 minutes generally. They're easy to understand. If you'd like something covered, shoot me a DM. If you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, that next season that I'm running into is to try to bring patients and providers in to sit down and carry on those conversations, to make it come from a second perspective or a third perspective, and not just me talking to a camera. If you have any questions or you want to learn anything, you can follow along our social media at MW Concussion on all major platforms. And again, thank you so much for understanding. Thank you for breaking it down, because the whole goal of the Midwest Concussion Clinic is making the invisible visible again through education, understanding, and awareness. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you have a great rest of your day.